You're crouched at the edge of a clearing. It's 40,000 BC. The morning light is thin and gray, and the ground beneath your bare feet is warm in a way the rest of the world isn't yet. You're hungry. Not the kind of hungry where you open a cabinet and sigh at your choices. The other kind. The kind that has no off switch. And in front of you, half buried in the red earth, is a mound. A termite mound, taller than you are, humming with a faint internal vibration, like the whole thing is alive. Because it is. And you reach for a thin stick. You push it carefully into a hole near the base. You wait, and you pull it out covered in writhing, fat, protein-rich insects. And then, without ceremony, without disgust, without a single thought that this is in any way strange, you eat them. This is breakfast. This is normal. This is who we are. And here's the question that should bother you. If eating insects was so normal, so universal, so deeply woven into the human story that our ancestors did it every single day for hundreds of thousands of years, then why does the idea make most people watching this video want to gag? Why did we stop? And the deeper question, the one nobody really asks, what if we were the weird ones? What if the squeamish, insect-avoiding, chicken nugget-eating modern human is the strange branch on the tree, and the bug eater was the baseline all along? Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Eating insects isn't a quirky survival tactic from some desperate corner of prehistory. It might be one of the oldest, most consistent, most successful feeding behaviors our entire lineage has ever had. Older than cooking, older than fire possibly, older than the genus Homo itself. And the evidence for this is genuinely staggering once you start looking. So let's start at the beginning, and I mean the actual beginning, before we were even human. Because before you can ask why ancient humans ate bugs, you have to confront an uncomfortable fact. Our closest living relatives still do it. Chimpanzees, our cousins who split from our lineage somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago, are skilled, deliberate, tool-using insect hunters. Jane Goodall documented this back in 1960 at Gombe in Tanzania, and it shattered the scientific consensus of the time, because chimps weren't supposed to make tools. But there they were, stripping leaves off twigs, shaping them, inserting them into termite mounds, and fishing out a meal. They did it patiently. They did it skillfully. They taught it to their children. Termite fishing isn't an accident. It's a culture. Let that sink in. The act you imagined yourself doing at the start of this video, crouched at a mound with a stick, is not a human invention. It's an inheritance. It is older than us. We didn't discover bug eating. We were born into it. We walked out of the forest already knowing how. Now let's talk about what happened when our ancestors stood up and walked into the open. Because somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, the early members of our family tree, the Australopithecines, and the first members of genus Homo, were doing something fascinating in the caves of South Africa. There's a site called Swartkrans in the region paleoanthropologists half-jokingly call the cradle of humankind. And in the 1980s and beyond, researchers found something odd there: bone tools. Dozens of them, worn and polished at the tip in a very particular way. For years, nobody knew exactly what these tools were for. Were they used to dig up roots? To work hides? The mystery sat there. And then, around 2001, two researchers, Lucinda Backwell and Francesco D'Erico, decided to actually test the question instead of guessing. They took replica bone tools and used them for different tasks: digging tubers, working skin, and crucially, digging into termite mounds. And then they put the originals under a microscope and compared the microscopic wear patterns. The wear on the ancient tools matched the termite mound experiment. The polish, the rounding, the tiny parallel scratches. They lined up with insects, not roots, not hide. Think about that for a second. Almost 2 million years ago, one of our ancestors, possibly a member of a species you've never heard of, called Paranthropus robustus, was manufacturing specialized tools for the express purpose of eating bugs. This wasn't grabbing a beetle off a log out of desperation. This was a technology, a dedicated insect acquisition toolkit, engineered, repeated, passed down. And here's where it gets interesting. Why termites? Why insects at all, when these creatures had teeth and could, in theory, chase down a small animal or chew on a tough plant? The answer is brutal, beautiful economics. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a bug the same way again. Let's talk about what's actually inside an insect, because we've been trained culturally to think of a bug as essentially nothing, a speck, a nuisance, a thing that has no nutritional value because it's so small. And that is completely, catastrophically wrong. Gram for gram, many edible insects are nutritional powerhouses. Crickets, depending on the species and how they're measured, can be somewhere in the range of 60 to 70% protein by dry weight. 60 to 70%. That's more protein dense than beef, more than chicken. And it comes packaged with iron, with zinc, with calcium, with B vitamins, with healthy fats. The exact micronutrients a growing brain and a working body are screaming for. And now remember what was happening to our ancestors during this exact stretch of time. Their brains were exploding in size. The human brain is metabolically obscene. It's roughly 2% of your body weight, but it devours something like 20% of your energy at rest. You do not grow an organ that greedy on leaves and luck. You grow it on dense, reliable, high-quality nutrition. And insects delivered exactly that. Here's the part that makes the whole thing click. A termite mound, or a swarm of locusts, isn't a needle in a haystack. It's a concentrated, predictable, often seasonal jackpot of food that doesn't run away very fast, doesn't fight back with antlers or claws, and doesn't require you to risk your life sprinting across a savanna full of predators to catch it. A child can do it. An elderly person can do it. A pregnant woman can do it. That last point matters more than you might think, because so much of the story of human evolution gets told as a story of dramatic, dangerous, big game hunting. Spears, mammoths, heroic men. And sure, that happened, but hunting large animals is high risk and high failure. You can chase prey all day and come home with nothing. Insects don't do that to you. Insects are the reliable foundation underneath the dramatic spike of the hunt. They're not the highlight reel. They're the bedrock. It became instinct. It became the baseline. It became the quiet, daily, unglamorous reason our ancestors didn't starve. Now let's go forward in time to actual anatomically modern humans, people who looked exactly like you, who had your brain, your hands, your capacity for language and art and grudges. Did they eat bugs? Oh, they ate bugs. And we don't have to guess, because we have something almost unbelievably direct. We have their preserved waste. I want to introduce you to one of the least glamorous and most valuable resources in all of archaeology. It's called a coprolite. A coprolite is fossilized or desiccated ancient human feces. And before you make a face, understand this. A coprolite is a time capsule. It is a perfectly preserved snapshot of a single meal eaten by a single human being thousands of years ago, frozen at the exact moment of digestion. In a place called Hines Cave in southwest Texas, researchers have studied human coprolites dating back many thousands of years. And inside them, alongside seeds and plant fibers and the remains of small animals, they found insect parts, the hard, indigestible bits of bugs. Grasshoppers, other insects. People weren't eating these by accident, swallowing a fly with their water. The quantities and the patterns tell a story of deliberate, regular consumption. These were meals. Planned, harvested, eaten meals. And this is the part I find genuinely moving, because that coprolite is the closest thing we will ever have to sitting down across a fire from a person who lived thousands of years before writing, before agriculture, before cities, and asking them, "What did you have for dinner?" And the answer comes back across the millennia, clear and unembarrassed. Bugs. We had bugs. We were fine. We were better than fine. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because this wasn't just a New World thing or an Old World thing. It was an everywhere thing. It was a human thing. Let's talk about the written record, because the moment humans started writing things down, they wrote about eating insects. Completely casually, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, which to them, it was. Go back to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle, in his Historia Animalium around the 4th century BC, writes about cicadas. And he doesn't write about them with disgust. He writes about them like a food critic. He notes that the larvae are good to eat before the shell breaks. And he remarks that the adult females are especially tasty when they're full of eggs. Aristotle, one of the founding minds of Western philosophy, the teacher of Alexander the Great, is out here reviewing the optimal ripeness of bugs. And nobody around him thought that was strange. Go to the Bible. In the book of Leviticus, in a passage laying out which foods are permitted, there is explicit permission to eat certain insects: locusts, crickets, grasshoppers. It is written into religious law as clean, acceptable, sanctioned food. And the New Testament tells us that John the Baptist, living in the wilderness, survived on locusts and wild honey. That's not a footnote of desperation. That's a description of a perfectly normal wilderness diet. And then there's Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC, the so-called father of history, who traveled the known world cataloging the customs of different peoples. He describes groups who would catch locusts, dry them, grind them into a powder, and mix that powder with milk to drink. A locust protein shake. 2,500 years ago. The exact thing you can now buy in a fancy startup's recyclable pouch for $9. Was being made by people Herodotus met on the edge of the world. Let that land for a moment. The cutting-edge, sustainable superfood of the 21st century is a recipe so old that the father of history was writing it down as an exotic curiosity. We didn't invent the cricket protein bar. We rediscovered it. We circled all the way back around to where we started and slapped a label on it and called it innovation. So now we have to confront the real question, the uncomfortable one, the one this entire video has been building toward. If eating insects is this old, this universal, this nutritious, this deeply embedded in everything from chimpanzee culture to ancient scripture, then why on earth did a huge chunk of humanity stop? Why does the average person in Europe or North America today react to the idea of eating a cricket with genuine revulsion, while at this exact moment, an estimated 2 billion people around the world eat insects as a normal, valued, even celebrated part of their diet? Because that's the real number. According to a landmark report published by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in 2013, a report that genuinely shook up the conversation about the future of food, around 2 billion people on this planet regularly eat insects. And the number of edible insect species documented worldwide is somewhere around 1,900. 1,900 different species, eaten across Africa, Asia, Latin America, Australia, deliberately, traditionally, and often as a delicacy rather than a desperation food. So the squeamish ones, the people who find this disgusting, are not the global majority. They are a specific cultural pocket. And understanding how that pocket formed is the key to the whole mystery. So let's talk about how we became the weird ones. The leading explanation has very little to do with biology and almost everything to do with farming. Roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, in a few key regions of the world, humans pulled off the agricultural revolution. We domesticated grasses into wheat and barley and rice. We domesticated animals into cattle and sheep and pigs and chickens. And in doing so, in the parts of the world where this took hold most aggressively, something subtle and profound shifted in how people saw insects. Because the moment you're a farmer, the insect stops being food. The insect becomes the enemy. The locust isn't dinner anymore. The locust is the swarm that descends on your wheat field and destroys a year of labor in an afternoon, and leaves your entire village to starve through the winter. The beetle isn't a snack. It's the pest boring into your grain stores. Agriculture turned insects from a harvest into a threat. And over many generations, in those grain-based societies, the cultural meaning of the bug curdled from food into filth. Think about it. If your entire civilization's survival depends on protecting your crops from insects, you are going to build a deep, emotional, almost moral disgust toward those insects. You're going to teach your children that bugs are dirty, that bugs are damage, that bugs are the enemy at the gate. And that disgust, that learned cultural, agricultural disgust, gets passed down so thoroughly that thousands of years later, a person in a clean, modern kitchen who has never seen a wheat field in their life still flinches at the sight of a cricket on a plate without having the faintest idea why. It's not instinct, it's inheritance. Just a different inheritance from the one our ancestors carried. We didn't lose the ability to eat bugs. We were taught, slowly, over millennia, to be afraid of them. The disgust feels ancient and natural and bone deep, but it's actually one of the more recent things about us. And here's a detail that makes this even sharper. The places where insect eating survived and thrived are very often the places where large-scale grain agriculture and big domesticated livestock didn't dominate in the same way. In many tropical regions, in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, insects remained an obvious, efficient, delicious source of protein, and the culture around them never soured. They kept the old knowledge. We're the ones who forgot it. We're the ones who traded a 1900 species pantry for a handful of domesticated animals, and then convinced ourselves that our narrow menu was the sophisticated one. So let's go back to that termite mound. Back to you, crouched in the gray morning light, 40,000 years ago, stick in hand, no disgust in your heart, eating a breakfast that your species had been eating for 2 million years and would keep eating in most of the world right up to the present day. You weren't doing something primitive, you were doing something perfected. You were participating in possibly the longest running, most successful feeding strategy in the entire history of the human lineage. A strategy that fed our exploding brains, that didn't require risking death on the savanna, that a child or an elder could perform, that scripture would later bless, and historians would later record, and the United Nations would thousands of years on hold up as a model for feeding a hungry planet. And the modern world, the world of factory-farmed beef and methane and deforestation and food systems straining at the seams, is now slowly, awkwardly, expensively turning back toward the exact thing you held in your hand that morning. The startups, the protein bars, the lab-grown cricket flour, the sustainability reports. They heard a podcast about the future of food and ran. And the future they sprinted toward turns out to be 2 million years old. But here's the thing. Everything I've just told you, the tools at Swartkrans, the coprolites in Texas, the chimpanzees, the FAO numbers, all of it explains what we ate and why we stopped. None of it explains the strangest part, because there's a piece of this story that almost nobody talks about. A reason the disgust runs as deep as it does. A hidden trigger buried inside your own body that decides, in a fraction of a second, before you've even had a conscious thought, whether a thing in front of you is food or horror. And once you understand what that trigger really is, and where it came from, and why it can be switched off in a single generation, you'll realize the question was never really about the bugs at all. It was always about you. So why, exactly, does your stomach turn?